In this seminar, organized by the Research Institute for Bilingual Learning and Teaching at the Open University of Hong Kong, Professor Becky Xi Chen, professor in the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development, OISE, at the University of Toronto in Canada, discusses her research on lexical specificity and how it is related to phonological awareness and word reading in English. The subjects of her research studies are children in French immersion classes in Ontario, Canada.
I'm very happy to be here to share with you my research. So because I'm situated in Canada and not everybody's familiar with the situation there, I'd like to start with a quick introduction of the French immersion context in Canada. English and French, both official languages in Canada. So because of that, English-French bilingualism is a highly valued societal goal in the Canadian education system. So when children go to kindergarten, there are 2 years of kindergarten in most provinces in Canada. When they go to junior kindergarten, everybody is instructed in English. But then when they enter senior kindergarten in the second year, then parents can make a decision for their children. So they can either keep their children in the English language kindergarten, or they can send their children to French immersion programs. So that's the context where I conduct my research in French immersion programs. So children start in senior kindergarten, and they're instructed entirely in French, so there's no English involved. But interestingly, at least where I'm situated in Toronto, Ontario, nobody speaks French outside of the classroom. So English is like the societal language, and French, if you go to a French immersion program, French is the school language. And also for children who go to French immersion programs, they're not francophones, so their parents actually do not speak French. So it's purely a school language. They speak it in the classroom, but they don't speak it on the playground, or when they go home, they don't speak it either. So it's a very interesting language situation. For children who are native speakers of French, for Francophone children, they actually don't go to French immersion, they go to French language schools. So for my presentation, for my research, children, they are not Francophones. They speak English at home, but they learn French as a school language. French immersion starts in senior kindergarten in SK, and children are instructed entirely in French. English is introduced in grade 4, so before grade 4, everything is in French, but English is initially introduced as a school subject in grade 4, and then the percentage of English gradually increases. I think by grade 8, they get half and half English, half French. This is another interesting thing about French immersion. It's a publicly funded program, so it's not a private school, and it's funded by the government and is free of charge. So if parents decide to send their children to French immersion, they can do so. But still, children who go to French immersion tend to be from families who are in the middle class or upper middle class backgrounds. I think that's probably because well-educated parents are more aware of the needs of bilingualism. It's probably the same everywhere. But in recent years, there's an increasing number of language minority children in French immersion programs. So these children, they're not native speakers of English. We call them ELL, English Language Learners. So it's very interesting because they have their first language, and then their second language is English, and their third language is French. So they are becoming trilingual. It's a very interesting language situation. Okay, so I said these children, they have little exposure to French outside of the school setting, but because they're exposed to English in the broader community, they are developing English and French simultaneously. So that's actually the success of the French immersion program. So children acquire language and literacy skills in French, but at the same time, they're also gaining language and literacy skills in English due to exposure to English in the society, and also home language and literacy activities, because parents still tend to teach their children in English at home. So over time, these children will become fully functional bilinguals in English and French. So this is about my research. I have a research lab, and We just gave it a name. It's called the Multilingualism and Literacy Lab. It's kind of a made-up name. And we have 3 areas of research that we do. So the first direction is comparison of English first language and English language learners' performance in French immersion. That's very interesting because for language minority children, they learn French at school, and then they speak a little bit of English, with their friends, but then at home, they don't speak either English or French. So we're interested in seeing whether they also develop English skills due to this reduced exposure. So we've done a series of studies on this topic, and we found that actually they do quite well. So they are at least becoming bilinguals in English and French, despite reduced exposure to English. But some of them also maintain their first language, but that requires quite a bit of effort on the parents' part. And the second direction of my research is risk identification and intervention. That's because traditionally in French immersion programs, children are not assessed for a risk status until they're in grade 3 or grade 4. When they enter the program, they speak very little French, but they're asked to speak French entirely at school, but they speak very little. So in this context, it's very difficult to assess children for reading disabilities or learning disabilities. So the typical practice is to wait until they become more proficient in French, then they're assessed in French. But obviously, that's not ideal for somebody who truly has a deficit, because early identification and early intervention are keys for success. So again, we've done a series of studies to show that you can actually assess children in English, which is their stronger language, and then their performance in English when they enter French immersion programs is a good indicator of their success in French. And today, actually, I'm going to focus on the third direction, which is cross-language transfer. So this is about how children can use language and literacy skills they developed in their first language to support reading success in the second language. And because English and French are closely related languages, they share a lot of similarities in phonology, morphology, orthography, vocabulary in many different areas. So if you measure a skill in English and measure a skill in French, they tend to be highly correlated. And that's one of the reasons, actually, other than the environmental reason, why students can become English-French bilinguals. Because in the early years, they rely on their English skills to support development in French. But as they're instructed in French, they become more proficient in French. And then those skills then transfer from French to English to support English development. But I'm going to present a couple of empirical studies to show you how this works. The first study is called Learning Phonologically Specific Words Predicts Reading Ability for French Immersion Children. So the idea, the central concept of the study is lexical specificity. It's a very technical term, but it's actually very simple. It's the ability to identify words that are minimal pairs. I'll show a few examples here. So for example, the word bear and the word pear, they are minimal pairs because they sound very similar. They differ only one sound feature. And why is this ability important? That's because whether you can do this, indicator of the quality of your phonological representation in your mental lexicon. So if you have a very good representation of this word, your representation is solid and precise, you can differentiate words that sound very similar, and this will stimulate the development of phonological awareness, which is a critical predictor of word reading skills. So we can take a look at this chart again. So when children are young, they know words, but these words may not be related in phonology. In other words, they may not sound very similar. So they may know the word park and the word, say, nail. And then in that case, their phonological representations do not have to be very precise because these words do not sound similar. It's very easy to tell the differences. But as children gain in vocabulary, they learn words that sound similar. So they have bear and pear. So at this time, as their vocabulary size increases, their phonological representations have to become more precise. If they do not become more precise, then they get confused, right? In oral language and also in reading, because this is the foundation for phonological awareness. For phonological awareness, which is a very strong indicator of word reading skills. So what is phonological awareness? So phonological awareness is the ability to understand that a spoken word has smaller units of sounds. For example, if I say the word cat, it's just one word, right? But if you have phonological awareness, you know that this one word actually has 3 sounds in it. So it's k, a, and t. So it's not just one holistic piece. It has 3 sounds. And then later when you learn to read, you see the word cat has 3 letters. And then you develop letter-sound correspondences. That's how you develop decoding skills. That's why phonological awareness is so important for reading. So for this study, we have 3 research questions. So first, we want to see whether lexical specificity in English is related to phonological awareness in English, which then is related to word reading in English. So that's reading language in English. The second question is about reading language in French. It's parallel to the first question. So we wanted to see whether French lexical specificity is related to phonological awareness in French, and which is then related to word reading in French. I hope this makes sense. It's a little bit technical. And then the third question is the new piece we're adding, because people have shown actually with monolingual children that lexical specificity is related to phonological awareness. This is a well-known connection according to the lexical restructuring hypothesis, but we're extending it from phonological awareness also to word reading. But because our participants are English-French bilinguals, we look at this relationship not only in English, but also in French. And interestingly, we also look at it cross-language. So we assess children's phonological or lexical specificity in English, and we want to see whether this is related to word reading in French for them. So a little bit about the design of the study. We recruited about 60 French immersion children in grade 1, and we tested them twice in grade 1 at the beginning and at the end of grade 1. So this was a 1-year longitudinal study. We had some key measures, obviously, because we were looking at the relationship between lexical specificity, phonological awareness, and word reading. We have to measure these concepts. So we measured phonological awareness, and then we measured word reading accuracy. So these are standardized measures in English. They're readily available. The measures weren't available in French, so we created parallel experimental measures in French. And for lexical specificity, we had to be very creative because it was a new concept. We wanted to do a dynamic assessment. That means we want to teach children and see how well they learn. We believe that's a better way for assessment than just like giving them a standardized measure. So I'll walk you through the basic rationale for this task. So the goal is to see whether children can tell the difference between words with minimal pairs, so faux and so. These 2 words sound very similar, but they differ by one phonetic feature. So how do we do it? Because we assess them dynamically. First, we teach them these words, and then we ask them whether they can tell the difference between the 2. So we have 2 learning phases, and then we have a testing phase. So in the first learning phase, we teach them the word faux and so. So actually, we teach them each word twice. But for the sake of time, I'm only going to show you one learning phase. So they actually learn each word twice. And then in the testing phase, they're given both words and asked whether these words sound the same or different. So this is what they actually do in this. It's a computerized game in this game. So we say, show me the faux. So, well, they don't know the word faux, but this is the bow. So this is supposed to be another minimal pair with faux. But they have to be able to tell the difference between faux and bow. And these 2 are, we call them fillers. So this is hand, this is sink. So we say, show me the faux. And then they have to be able to infer that, okay, it's this word, that's faux. And they get another opportunity to learn this word. And then for target 2, we say, show me the so. So again, here, this is the control word because bow and so also sound similar. but not the same. And then we have two fillers. This is a tent. This is like a bird cage. So they learn the word so, and they also get another opportunity to learn this word in this game. And then this is the testing phase. We say, show me the fo. So now they see both so and fo, and they have to be able to tell the difference. So the idea is, first, they have to be able to tell the difference between fo and bo. So these words sound similar, but they're different. And then they have to be able to tell the difference between so and bo. Again, similar but different. But if you're a linguist, you will know that so and fo actually sound more similar than those words with bo. So those words differ by two phonetic features, but fo and so differ only by one phonetic feature. So I guess it goes from easy to challenging, but actually it's not that easy. But anyway, children actually learn to do this. Anyway, so those were the measures, and now I wanted to show you some results. So this was wrong with the mediation models. So we showed that English lexical specificity assessed at time 1 is related to English phonological awareness at time 1, and this is related to English word reading at time 2, and this effect is mediated through English phonological awareness at time 1. And so this is one route. And we have another route that's English lexical specificity at time 1 is related to English phonological awareness at time 1, and then to English word reading at time 1, and then to English word reading at time 2. So this, I guess, confirms our hypothesis that lexical specificity has an impact on phonological awareness, which is then related to word reading. These are just control variables we controlled for first language because some children were language minority kids, SES, and working memory because the lexical specificity task required a bit of memory. So these are the English within language results. And now let's take a look at the French within language results. We don't have a lot of results here. The only significant finding we had was from French phonological awareness at time 1 to French word reading at time 2. This is a well-established relationship in previous research. Everybody knows that phonological awareness is related to word reading, but we did not find any significant relationships between lexical specificity and phonological awareness or with word reading. And we think that's because their French is a lot weaker in grade 1 than their English. The most interesting findings are the cross-language findings. So cross-language transfer, we found that English lexical specificity measured at time 1 is related to English phonological awareness at time 1, and that's related to French word reading at time 2. In other words, you can assess their English lexical specificity and use that to predict word reading in French. 1 year later, we see another route that's English lexical specificity at time 1 is related to English phonological awareness at time 1, which is then related to French phonological awareness at time 1, which is related to French word reading at time 2. So there's a bit of cross-language transfer of phonological awareness as well. So you see this relationship and this relationship. Okay, so those are the main findings of the study. So we found that lexical specificity is related to phonological awareness, which is then related to word reading in English. And that's because English is the children's stronger language. Theoretically speaking, our study extends the lexical restructuring hypothesis by demonstrating that lexical specificity is connected to word reading in bilingual children's first language through the mediation of phonological awareness. So this kind of research has now been done with bilingual children before, and to our knowledge, this was the first study. Curiously, we did not find many results within French, and we think that's because French is their weaker language at this time. Actually, we do a lot of studies on French immersion children. We always find that the relationships are stronger in English than in French for very young children because they're just developing their French proficiency. So the last one is the cross-language finding. So we found that it appears that English-French bilinguals rely on stronger representations of phonemes in English to develop stronger phonological awareness in English, which in turn facilitates word reading in French. So that's the cross-language finding. I'm going to present another study that's related but somewhat different from the first study. So this is a school-based phonological awareness intervention for struggling readers in early French immersion. So actually, the literature is kind of the same. So we already know that phonological awareness is a critical predictor of word reading success. So thousands and thousands of studies have shown that. There's nothing new here. At the same time, research has shown that interventions on phonological awareness lead to improved word reading skills. So in other words, this relationship is not just correlational, it's also causal. Again, thousands of studies have shown that. But what's new about this study? The novelty, it lies within the French immersion context. So in this study, we actually provide an intervention on English phonological awareness, and we expect to see that children improve in French word reading skills. So we rely on cross-language transfer, cross-linguistic transfer for the study. So we wanted to show that for French immersion children, you don't have to wait until they develop proficiency in French to intervene as soon as they enter French immersion programs, because English is their stronger language. You can actually intervene in English, and that will lead to better word reading outcomes in French. So the purpose of the study was to examine the effect of phonological awareness intervention in English on French phonological awareness and word reading in the French immersion context. So this was quite a large study, and it definitely took a lot of effort. And we did it for 3 consecutive years. So children in 3 cohorts, a total of 250 children, were screened for a risk status upon entry to grade 1. So obviously, for early identification, you can only do it in English because they hardly knew any French at this time. Children who scored below 30th percentile on both English phonological awareness and English word reading, we identify them. Actually, we didn't officially identify them. We call them at-risk readers because they were low on both phonological awareness and word reading. We thought they would be at risk for reading difficulties later on. So among 252 children, we only found 16 children. So it's quite a bit of effort, but we didn't find a lot of children with reading who were at-risk readers. And that also shows that the French immersion program is sort of an elite program in the public school system because these children come from a high SES backgrounds. So the percentage of at-risk children is lower than in the general population. In the general population, you at least see maybe 10% of the kids, so you have probably 25, but here we only had 16. And then we divided these children into an intervention group and the control group, and we offered them a phonological awareness intervention in English. It's a 1-year intervention, but unfortunately, during this year, we also lost 4 children. So now our sample size was reduced to 12. And that's because that's another interesting phenomenon of French immersion in Canada. When children start to struggle reading or with learning, parents get scared, they pull them out and pull them back to English programs. And that's because there aren't a lot of supports in French immersion programs, and working to change that. But anyway, so we lost 4 more kids, ended up with 12. So struggling readers, they were provided with small group instruction twice per week for 18 weeks. And I think for twice per week, and each session was about 20 minutes. So the total amount of instruction was about 15 hours in total. And this was according to very clear guidelines that this would be the amount that children could benefit from. The experimental group was provided with phonological awareness training in combination with letter-sound correspondence instruction. So basically, we provided storybooks, and we read those books with kids, and we identified words to work with children. So we identify words, syllables, phonemes, and we would do these phonological awareness activities with children while we were reading the books. So the intervention followed a sequence. So we started with sentence, and then went into words, and then syllables, sounds, and phonemes. So from larger units to smaller units. Again, that's being established in research. When children develop phonological awareness, they first become aware of larger units, and gradually they become aware of smaller units. And phoneme is the smallest unit, and phonemic awareness is most strongly related to reading. And we decided to use authentic children's literature instead of like a program that's commercially available, because we thought that would be more authentic and more motivating to children. And the control group was provided with the same storybooks, but they weren't given phonological awareness activities with the books. Instead, they were doing vocabulary activities. So that was intervention, and now I'm going to show you some results. So we did the intervention for 1 year. When children were in grade 1, we tested them before the intervention, after the intervention, so pre-test and post-test, and then we followed them up for 2 more years. So they were tested again in grade 2, and then again in grade 3. So we had 4 testing points for English, actually, but for French, we didn't have a pre-test in French because they didn't know anything. But we can start with English first. So at pre-test, there was no difference between the experimental group and the control group. We randomly assigned children to the 2 groups. At time 2, after the intervention, the experimental group did much better on English phonemic awareness than the control group, and the difference was significant. And it was quite large. But unfortunately, in grade 2 and grade 3, even though the difference was still quite large, the effect size was still quite large, they were no longer significant. I think that's because we had such a small sample size, not enough power to detect significant findings. So for English word reading, this is kind of interesting. I mean, overall, we had good results, but they weren't entirely consistent, as you get from most studies. So at pretest, there was no difference between the experimental group and the control group. And after the intervention, immediately, the experimental group did better than the control group. And over time, this difference actually became larger and reached significance in grade 3. So we thought maybe this kind of a speculation that as children received reading instruction, this phonological awareness training kicked in and had a larger effect later on. Okay, so those were the English results. And of course, we also tested them in French. We only tested them in French at time 2 after the intervention. And then this is the end of grade 1, this is grade 2, and this is grade 3. We didn't test them at the beginning of grade 1 because they didn't know any French at that time. It wouldn't make any sense. And we see that they did better on French phonemic awareness, not immediately after the intervention, but then in grade 2 and grade 3, they did better. Actually, the effect size was also quite large, but because our sample size was so small, sometimes it wasn't significant. So these are the best results. On French word reading, we found that the experimental group immediately outperformed the control group. And then this advantage was maintained for 2 years. So in other words, after they received a phonological awareness intervention in English, they did better on French word reading, and they kept this, I guess, benefit from grade 1 to grade 3. So that was the most impressive finding. Okay, so just a little bit of recap. The children who received the intervention demonstrated greater gains in English phonological awareness from pre-test to post-test. Group differences in French phonological awareness reached significance at delayed post-test and follow-up. Most importantly, the children who received the intervention outperformed the control group on French word reading at post-test, delayed post-test, and follow-up. Overall, the results suggest that for at-risk readers in French immersion, providing phonological awareness instruction in English facilitates French phonological awareness and French word readings. So the results of the study are quite interesting. They suggest that for children who receive instruction in their second language, you actually don't have to wait for 3 or 4 years before you assess them for reading disabilities, because if you do that, you waste 3 years of time, right? So you can actually assess them in their stronger language and also provide intervention in their stronger language. And then with time, you see improved performance in the second language. Just to summarize, I think because English and French are closely related languages, we found transfer with almost every skill. So I think it's a promising line of research. Thank you.